Welcome back to the Investigator discussion series. I'm rather Incoherent, and this is Mark Harrigan. In my opinion, easily the best Guardian in the game. Let's start with the stat line. 3 in head, 3 in foot. That's good Mythos defense, but for Guardians who usually have foot as an Achilles heel, that's actually really good Mythos defense. They're usually much worse off than this. Additionally, in a second we're going to talk about Sophie, and it's going to make these Mythos stats kind of crazy, and later on in deck building I'll cover some ways that I build Mark Harrigan that make him incredibly resilient to the Mythos, and make these stats feel completely untouchable. He has a 5 in fist, which is incredible. He's the only 5 fist Guardian that really plays a normal Guardian game plan. Daniela's not even really a Guardian. Nacho is very good, but he's playing an event-based deck. He's not really using weapons the way other Guardians do. If you want to play a generic weapon-based Guardian, this additional point in fist is a tremendous amount of extra reliability, and if somehow it's not enough, say you're cutting things that give you reliability and relying on this 5 fist, that's no problem that you encountered the one weirdly high fist enemy, because again, we're going to get to Sophie in a second, this 5 fist is actually 7 fist. And this 2 book, it's not impressive, it's essentially a wasted stat point, but Mark does have a 13-point stat line, up 1 from the normal 12, so he can afford to waste a stat here and still have a crazy stat line like this. You begin the game with Sophie and loving memory and play, and we're just going to cut to that immediately because Sophie is incredibly important. Sophie is a slotless asset that begins in play, cannot leave play, and as a lightning bolt you take 1 direct damage, you get +2 to your skill value for this skill test. That is absolutely tremendous. Just on tap unexpected courage. 1 direct damage is a little bit scary, especially because first, if Mark Harrigan has 5 or more damage on him, flip Sophie, and then it becomes you get -1 to each of your skills. You can flip it back over by healing though. When it comes to playing Mark, pilot decision making is very important. You want to be leveraging your health as a resource. You want to be getting these unexpected courages and getting value from them, but at the same time, you need to make sure this doesn't ever trigger and flip over and cripple all of your skills. It's catastrophic if that happens. So this sort of changes the way you evaluate healing and deck building in general on Mark. Coming back to his character card though, that's not the only thing Sophie does, because reaction, after damage is placed on a card you control, draw 1 card, limit once per phase. So Sophie's actually letting you draw a lot of cards. If you get hit during the enemy phase, you draw a card. If you take a Mythos test during the Mythos phase and you tap Sophie for it, you draw a card. If you do something during your own turn and you use Sophie for +2 for better odds, you draw a card. And it makes Mark Harrigan the highest draw Guardian in the game by a very large margin. It gives him sort of unparalleled consistency and reliability, because again, you can treat this stat line as 5, 4, 7, 5, which is a shitload of Mythos resilience. You commit anything to any of those tests you're going to pass. His star is unfortunately completely blank, but at least it will be a guaranteed pass, and his soak split is what you would expect for that ability, 9 in health, 5 in horror. It sort of doesn't matter that he has 9 health, because when you play Mark, you tend to pilot him like he has 5 health. You never ever want to take that 5th damage and flip Sophie. Additionally, because Sophie works this way, Mark Harrigan's one of the only characters in the game where you're basically never taking in the thick of it. You don't want to start with 2 health damage closer to flipping Sophie with less room to use your ability, and you don't want to take horror trauma because you would one auto fail rotting remains and you're out. So Mark Harrigan's kind of the only character that doesn't really even look at in the thick of it. In terms of deck building, he has deck size 30, Guardian 0 to 5, Neutral 0 to 5, and Tactics 0. That's it. Now, Tactics 0 gives him access to some pretty good stuff, but it is fairly restrictive deck building. It's why he has such strong abilities and such a great stat line, is sort of as compensation for his very restrictive deck building. Coming over to his signatures, we have the home front. It is a skill that commits for 4 fists, so just don't auto fail. And if it is successful during an attack, move 1 damage from Mark Harrigan to the attacked enemy, so it's also a pseudo heal, pseudo vicious blow type effect. It is very good. Notably, it is practice, and as we'll cover shortly, the tactics he gets access to does include practice makes perfect. And his weakness can be terrifying to inexperienced Mark players, and you will be playing around it forever even as an experienced Mark player, but it's not something that I really see go off that often at my table. Shell Shock says Revelation, for every 2 damage on you, take 1 horror. So if you're at 4 health about to flip Sophie, this is going to deal 2 horror to you, which is a little bit scary because you only have 5 horror soak. If you're at 7 health and Sophie's already flipped, it's going to deal 3 horror to you, and it might just kill you. 3 is 60% of your base horror soak. When you're playing Mark, you're always trying to jump around between 0 and 3 health. You don't ever want Shell Shock to deal you 2 horror. You don't ever want 1 Mythos card to get drawn and then push you to flip Sophie. You're playing healing pretty generously as Mark. And now, coming back to Mark is a character that on the surface looks like he can 3-man fight, and you absolutely can build decks that do. And if that team happens to be like a Bless team, right? You've given Mark an Ancestral token to put Blesses in the bag, and someone else is running Key of Solomon, Mark Harrigan can just ignore half of what I've been saying, right? Your teammate will heal you. You don't need to worry about shit. Tap Sophie all you want. The Key of Solomon will keep you alive with the Blesses that you're putting in the bag. And it's notable that Mark can benefit so much from team support like that. I'm not really taking that into consideration, that specific of team support when I rank characters. But for the vast majority of Mark Harrigans, you really have to play around what your health is at. And the result of this is that, barring the specific Blessed team composition I just mentioned, that even though you could build a Mark deck that can 3-man fight, you're never going to have the time to play healing cards on yourself when you're trying to fight for 3 people at once. You're going to be so tight on actions that actually keeping yourself healed and using Sophie freely is going to be really hard to do. So Mark Harrigan's a character that I actually do not recommend 3-man fighting on. It's something where usually the best fighters 3-man fighting is a part of their value. That's not how I view Mark. I view Mark as being insanely good when you don't try to force him to 3-man fight, because then he runs out of the time to heal himself, and if your teammates are okay with that, they're gonna run healing cards, they're gonna solve it. It doesn't have to be Key of Solomon, you can do it. But it's something that has to be organized. It's not like Tony, where Tony shows up and everyone just silently decides not to run fighting cards and that Tony will handle it. With Mark, if you're gonna put it on his back, you really need to let him use his ability and heal for him, since he's not gonna have time to do it anymore. Let's start talking about some deck lists. I'm going to show off Flex Mark a little bit. This is a pet deck of mine. I fucking love this deck. The core of the deck concept was the realization that Winging It is actually pretty playable in Mark Harrigan. If I play Winging It, I reduce the Shroud by 1. If I tap Sophie, I go up 2 book. That's a base value of 5. There are plenty of 2 and 3 Shroud locations where I'm comfortable tapping Sophie to try to use Winging It there. And if I could, say, commit a Perception or something to it, that's 7. Suddenly I'm cracking pretty much every location in the game. But like, running Perception in Mark Harrigan, that seems like a pipe dream, right? That's silly. But there was an important realization that I made when I was trying to make Winging It work that caused the whole deck to click together, which is that Guts is really good with 3 head and +2 head on tap that draws a card. You commit Guts, you use Sophie, you test 7 to Mythos, and you usually pass. It's great. The same exact thing is true with manual decks and foot test. Obviously I'm hitting dudes, Overpower is good, it's just a way to cycle a card and lower deck size while giving myself greater reliability. And Perception's the only neutral skill I wasn't running. Bestow Resolve's a card that is generally hard to fit into a deck because it kind of needs you to run all 8 neutral skills to be insane, or some other niche cards, where you have a bunch of skills that are generally widely disparate in their use, and Bestow Resolve lets you commit them for question marks instead, and suddenly they become crazy because now they're being used on any test. Because Mark Harrigan can just Bestow Resolve a Guts into a Winging It check, or an Overpower, or any of the neutral skills, suddenly he can reliably crack any location on the board. Additionally, because he's walking around with Overpower and Guts and Bestow Resolve in play, and he's a bodyguard character, Safeguard's in this list, even though it's a flex character I'm expecting to power around with my team, I'm gonna be near my team. I don't even have to be at their exact location, but if I am, I can commit them manual decks, then Lightning Bolt, and commit again with Bestow Resolve and give them some other skill, Overpower, Perception. It doesn't even have to be one of those, right? Coming over to Hallowed Mirror. I'm not a fan of committing Soothing Melody, but it's worth noting in a Bestow Resolve deck, this commits for 3 question marks if you need to use it for that. So the huge thing that made my table really start thinking Mark wasn't just a great fighter, but a brilliant character all around, was realizing that his Mythos stats enabled you to play a Bestow Resolve where you already ran Overpower, Guts, and manual decks. You're probably going to be powering around next to somebody who uses Book, and you can use Book on Winging It yourself, so it results in a really easy to slot in Bestow Resolve that just works really well in the character. And this Bestow Resolve is just so much team support. And for anyone wholly unfamiliar with Bestow Resolve, because I can see how someone would look at this, decide it's not very powerful, and write it off, like there, but for the grace of God go I. It is a 2-cost arcane slot that costs 2 experience, it gets 4 charges, and Lightning Bolt during a skill test performed by an investigator at your location or a connecting location, you don't even have to be there, spend 1 charge. Commit a non-weakness card from your hand to that skill test, treating all of its icons as question marks. That is really powerful if you have the cards to fuel it. Mark, considering he's running all the neutral cantrips and drawing constantly with Sophie, is going to find this reliably and find things to throw into it. As a quick heads up on how Bestow Resolve works as well, the commit 1 card to skill test thing, it's not a limitation, it's just step in skill test taking. There is a Lightning Bolt window when you start a skill test, followed by everyone may commit 1 card to the skill test if they are at that location, followed by another Lightning Bolt. So you can actually use Bestow Resolve and just commit like all 4 cards of it immediately to 1 test if for some reason you need to. That will never happen, but I have seen on quite a number of occasions somebody with a 1 in a test on a really important test, a Mark will like double tap Bestow and feed them Perception and Overpower to pass a head test. And when they pass, because Mark has just dragged them kicking and screaming to the finish line, Mark will draw 2 cards off of that. And Mark's uniquely good at this Bestow Resolve stuff because Sophie is giving him so much additional draw with this ability on his character card. Additionally, running all these cantrips just makes your deck much more consistent, and the whole Bestow Resolve package, while I originally put it together because I really wanted to play Flex Mark with winging it, yeah, it's actually just good in every version of Mark, and Mark's uniquely good at Bestow Resolve. And while making winging it work for Mark was really cool because you can easily overdraw the winging it and just discard it and then use it from your graveyard and you're cycling your deck so fast you'll find it again, the real star of the deck is Runic Axe. Flex Runic Axe is a thing where I always try to make other characters use it and I never find myself happy with it. I've tried it on Vincent and it works, but it's not the same as it is on Mark, not even close. And the way this one works is rather than getting Saga like a fighter would, you still take Ancient Power and Script Weaver for the massive burst turns where you easily deal with one enemy for a huge amount of value. You leave out Saga, you're not the main fighter, you don't have to fight every turn, and you pick up Inscription of the Elders and Glory, allowing you to heal yourself or draw cards, as well as discover clues at your location if you succeed by the Shroud value. Let's imagine a scenario I've seen pretty frequently on Flexmark. You're fighting a Hunting Night God. It's a fairly basic enemy in a lot of campaigns, but it is a problem. It's a 3-fist, 4-health enemy. For our purposes, none of this text is going to matter. And let's say you're fighting it at a 3-shroud location. With Inscription of the Elders, you want to succeed your test by the Shroud value. And because of this, coming over the Hunting Night God, we need to know what the Shroud value of our location is. We're going to imagine it's a 3. So we need to beat a 3+3, effectively a difficulty 6 test to get value out of Elders. The way you do that is you say, all right, I'm gonna beat the bag except for autofail, and you commit things until you get to whatever the worst token in the bag is. This is obviously gonna be much harder to do on difficulty higher than standard, or you're just going to accept that there are a larger number of autofails that you can't really play around. But on many standard difficulty campaigns, that's an additional 4. So if you get your base value for the test up to a 10, then you can swing at 10, you get a -4, that's a total value of 6, you're at a 3-shroud location against a 3-fist enemy, you get all the clues from Elders that you committed for. Coming over to very simple math, the way you would play this, you would do this very frequently in your campaign. You have base 5 from being Mark, +1 from the base attack on the axe, you tap Sophie to go up to 8, and then you can commit any skill with Bestow Resolve to go up to 10. You can also commit specifically Overpower, you could find some other way to get bonuses or ask a friend for a skill. Most frequently, you just bestow something to yourself to beat the entire bag by Shroud value on an attack. And then for your charges, you spend all 3 charges on this 4-health enemy on damage, and then you Script Weave Elders. So when you kill it, because you drew anything other than autofail, you are going to get 3 clues from that location. If you're a Flex character and you have the capacity to, in one action, kill a 4-health enemy and get 3 clues, that puts you so far above pace, you have a tremendous amount of time to screw around drawing cards and setting up, and still be better than almost any other Flex character. To that end, the most core stuff in the deck just makes finding Runic Axe more easy. You run Stick to the Plan for E-Cash level 2 and Ever Vigilant to remove cards from your deck and set up faster. You put Shortcut under it because you don't want to force yourself to play a Winging It. You have Second Wind for draw and healing. You have Stand Together for draw and economy. The deck's pretty straightforward and streamlined towards this goal. You might look at this and think, is Second Wind and Hallowed Mirror really enough? And with most characters it wouldn't be. Mark draws so many cards that he will actually draw and find all 3 copies of Soothing Melody. Between 3 Soothing Melodies and 2 Second Winds, that is 10 healing. It's far more than you're going to need in a scenario. I have seen Mark autofail Grasping Hands, followed by drawing 2 or 3 more copies of that sort of card. And he has come out the other side just completely fine, because he's just going to draw enough cards to have Hallowed Mirror keep him going. He also has great soak in the form of Tetsuo, uniquely good in Mark, because when you soak someone else's damage on the Tetsuo, you're going to draw a card off of him. I'm not going to say that Flex Mark is clearly the best version of Mark. It's my pet deck for Mark. I think it's as good as any other Mark, but it is uniquely good at using the Investigate version of Runic Axe. It's very cool with winging it. Bestow Resolve is a massive amount of team support. I will mention this Brand of Gathaga is kind of core, because if you're in a longer scenario, you actually have no way to cycle your bestows and get more charges on them, other than discarding them with Brand of Gathaga so that you can redraw them in your next cycle. I will also show off what I would do with more experience in the final deck that I used in Return to Circle Undone. Garish Kadaki is obviously a great card in this sort of archetype. It makes it much easier to support your team and to get more value, beat your test, It's obviously good, just not core to the deck. I have Vigilant 4 if you're playing a team support sort of flex character, obviously very good in this sort of mark as well. There's a lot of cool stuff you can build into if you're playing a higher experience campaign towards the end of it. And something I really want to note about that deck is it started off basically just playing a slightly low weapon count fighter mark with winging it. Because Flex Mark really doesn't start off very flexy at all. He starts off very, very fighty. And it gives him a really unique role in terms of building teams, where if you have somebody who's like a dirty fighting rogue, this was played alongside main fighter Finn, then this is a wonderful character to pair with them. Not just because you're generally a high tempo, good fighter who can easily pick up slack in the early turns a lot of the time, but because in scenario 1, this is just fighter Mark that cut 2 weapons for winging it and is randomly running perception instead of some other stuff. So this is a character that can really help if you have a scenario 1 fighter who's going to be very weak, but they're going to scale up and be really good later. Mark Harrigan as a flex is actually wonderful for picking up the slack in that team. Now, coming over to a bog standard Runic Axe practice makes perfect fighter mark, I personally don't think this is remotely necessary. The simple fact is that if you just take the bottom 3 options on Runic Axe, I don't need to use practice makes perfect to duplicate Vicious Blow. It's not important to me, I'm gonna kill everything. So it's not that this deck is bad, it's hyper consistent, practice makes perfect, and mark with your signature Vicious Blow, overpower, and take the initiative as 7 hits, and you draw so many cards that your deck gets small and refined and you can understand what's in the pool very quickly. It's a brutally strong fighter. All it does is fight though. And it sort of hits the Nat Show barrier that I was talking about with Nat Show where, all right, if all you do is fight, then how Mythos resistant are you? What sort of team support do you provide? And this Mark Harrigan is a lot more Mythos resilient than Nat. He'd still be like somewhere high in A tier probably. I don't know if I'd rank him better than Lily because he feels more frail than a Lily. He can't really 3-man fight as well as a Lily. But this deck doesn't really, to me, get into S tier. It's very, very good, but I would much prefer to play the Bestow Resolve variant. Again, very similar to the previous deck. For a fighter, cutting weapons to make room for perception obviously feels weird, but with Bestow Resolve, this is giving you so much team support. Perception in an opening draw is never a dead card if you're paired with anyone who uses Book, because they're going to take a test, you throw in Perception, they get the clue, it might matter, it might not, and it instantly cycles itself. So while Perception's not a good card in a main fighter, it's great with Bestow and it quickly cycles towards the cards you actually care about. This deck is very all in on drawing Runic Axe, it's just Branding Gathaga level 1 and that's it for backup weapons. That's easier to get away with in a flex character. Part of the beauty of Flex Mark is that you can just really skimp out on weapons. Doesn't matter, you're the flex. You're gonna make up for it, it's not gonna be a problem. You'll get your weapons eventually, sooner than most flex characters with this game plan because of your mark. With Fighter Mark, it's a little bit sketchier. However, if you draw any small enemies, you can just go punch them. You have 5 Fist and Sophie. If they have 2 health, then it gets a little bit more cumbersome, but Bestow is still good enough to handle fighting for a couple of turns while you look for the axe. The main reason I'm okay with being so all in on the axe is just because I trust that I'm going to find it in Mark. If you look at my deck, I'm running a lot of cards that say draw on them. In fact, it's probably about half the deck. So while I don't like having my fighter be this all in on finding specifically their one weapon, no backup weapon comes close to Runic Axe, and I don't think of it as a weakness of the character so much as a slight strength of Flex Mark that this doesn't matter. And again, I really cannot overemphasize just how important Bestow Resolve is to me for evaluating Mark's strength. He's able to run all these neutral skills. I know everyone can run them, but in most characters, you end up with an inconsistent sort of shitty deck. Mark's built-in draw with Sophie lets him really easily get away with this without impeding his own game plans. His great stat line for using literally any of these skills himself means that they're never, ever going to be dead cards in your hand. There are so many Guardians that could run Bestow Resolve. Like, you could run Bestow Resolve in Leo, but Manual Dex is a fucking useless card in Leo, right? Mark's stat line and built-in draw makes Bestow Resolve work so incredibly well in him, and it's such a tremendous amount of team support. It's not like as good as what Daryl does baseline, but the closest thing in the game to Bestow Mark is Daryl's ability. It's that good. And one of the coolest things about the starter decks for these decks is that if you look at the starter deck for the fighter version of Bestow Resolve, or for the Kluver version of Bestow Resolve, it's remarkably similar. Essentially, you're running Winging It in the starter deck of this, and if you switch over to the fighter deck, you're going to be running more backup weapons. I've also cut one shortcut for an additional, I think it's Enchanted Blade. But yeah, if you're running the baseline fighter without your upgraded Runic Axe, you're probably just going to cram in a lot more backup weapons, whereas with the flex deck, it's just not as big of a deal that you have these backup weapons. You can afford to run whatever you want. And in our case, it's frankly fairly low value Winging It that we're not going to get a ton done with in scenario 1. It's much better with Bestow later on. Now, both upgrade paths are remarkably similar because both say you upgrade the runic axe immediately. If you're a fighter all in on one best weapon in the game, you get that immediately. If you're a flex character where runic axe is the way you flex, you really need Inscription of the Elders, as well as Script Weaver so that you can actually get things done with it, and Ancient Power to use it and damage multiple times in one swing. Regardless of what configuration the runic axe takes, it is the most important part of the deck. From there, I really won't bestow resolve. It's just tremendously important to the core concept of the deck, and it's actually so important that if I found myself at like 5 experience only able to take one thing, I'd be willing to take like Saga and a Bestow. I wouldn't be like, I'm gonna bank 2 experience for future axe upgrades. Bestow is literally the thing this deck is built to do. After the opening 13 or 14 experience where you're getting your axe and your bestows, I really value Strong Armed and Brandigathaga. Brandigathaga is just a brilliant backup weapon. Strong Armed is the sort of thing that it's incredible. Not only is it +1 damage or 1 less charge spent on the axe, it's also your axe cannot fail. And if you're killing a 4 health enemy, whether you're just doing it because you're the fighter or you're doing it because you're a flex and about to pick up 3 clues, either way, not being able to lose those 3 charges and auto fail is really valuable. Brandigathaga is much more important in the fighter version because in the fighter version, you need a backup weapon that goes into play with your runic axe. In Fighter Mark, if you're being forced to 3-man fight or your teammates aren't helping very much, absolutely consider upgrading this Brandigathaga as a potential core thing you need to do, because the runic axe on its own can get taxed pretty heavily if it's required to 3-man fight, and you just have enemy after enemy after enemy just piling up for like 2 or 3 turns of bad luck. The axe can run dry, and Brandigathaga is invaluable when that happens. Other characters will do things like run Sweeping Kick and other sorts of pseudo-fighting cards, like Beat Cops, Guard Dogs, Skills, Events, what have you. There's just not room if you're running Bestow Resolve. Brand's kind of the only other card you can cram into Mark if you're going for Bestow, but I think Bestow is absolutely worth it. It's just an insane amount of team support. And I was like, all right, what's left in the upgrade path? What's most important? And as always, Stand Together is just left high and dry. It's not the thing that does my job. It's not the thing that rounds out my corners. It's very good. You can always argue to do Stand Together earlier in a build. I always want to, but I think it's only until like about 20 experience in when you start really looking at Stand Together versus Stick to the Plan. If I have a rogue on my team who can give me money with Falstian or a seeker who can give me money with Practicase, it might not be Stick to the Plan. I might go Stand Together level 3 first and try to just like make both of us a lot stronger, trusting them to give me money. But if I don't have that, the economy in the deck's pretty thin. I would not mind running Stick to the Plan or Stand Together first. They're roughly equivalent, and these only ever get bought once you have Stick to the Plan, giving you a guaranteed 1 draw early on, or just Ever Vigilant, but it's insane because it's in your opening hand only. Coming over to the tier list, I currently have Mark as my 5th highest character. I really like Mark Harrigan. I think he's incredibly strong. Bestow Resolve as a support package gets him so much higher than he otherwise might be. He can be an incredibly consistent fighter with Practice Makes Perfect, but I find that he's already an incredibly consistent fighter without it. He can be a really interesting flex character that lets you make some wonky teams with weird power curves, where he starts off as basically the fighter and then swaps roles with a rogue that was playing a stronger flex deck but planning to upgrade into a fighter. I love what flex Mark offers to the game, but I don't really think he's any stronger than a basic Bestow fighter Mark. I think they perform at similar levels but in completely different teams. I used to think that Fighter Mark was the weaker of the two because you can't really 3-man fight with him, but it's not that that's bad, it's just that he's not meant for that sort of team. Or if he is in that sort of team, they need to give something back to him. They need to run Howled Mirror, they need to run Kia Solomon, they need to run Archive of Conduits. And it's not on Mark that his teammates are putting pressure on him that he cannot deal with, and the fact that other characters can't deal with it is a strength of that character, but not a weakness of Mark. Because what Mark gives you when you let him 2-man fight is a remarkably consistent 2-man fighter, very nearly impervious in a Mythos deck, able to provide a tremendous amount of team support by giving these skills to his teammates with Bestow. He's essentially able to play Promise of Power ++ at will, right? You use Bestow, your teammates next to you, you commit manual decks to the foot test, and then you also give them Overpower with Bestow. You give them +4 to the test, but you draw 2 cards when they succeed. It's just really strong. I cannot overstate the number of times I've seen Mark Harrigan just make someone else pass a test, the number of times I've seen a Mark pass a test that I thought he couldn't because it turned out his hand was just filled with shit he could easily commit to it. It's worth noting that as far as fighters go, Mark is remarkably good at dodging people. Again, you have base 3 foot, you can bump it to 5 with Sophie, you can commit manual decks, you can bestow anything. It's just really easy for him to trip guys, weirdly enough. There is nothing weak about Mark. The thing that can be scary with Mark is the idea that you have to heal yourself and you don't have time to heal yourself. Runic Axe is a high enough tempo method of fighting, and there are other alternatives. Even if you weren't talking about Runic Axe, you can be playing decks with Strong Armed, Practice Makes Perfect, Vicious Blow, and you can use these cards to just get enough bonus damage in your deck with other weapons that you're just going to deal with the enemies quickly and have time to heal. And because Mark has so much draw, Hallowed Mirror is notably better in him than almost any other Guardian. He's able to use Second Wind, he's able to find the time to do it if you're not making a 3-man fight, and I just don't see Mark Harrigan as a character that usually ends up in that much danger. Like, I've seen Mark Harrigans get completely bullied by Mythos decks. I've seen them, like, turn 1, manual decks Sophie on Roddy remains, and then auto-feel it, and take 4 damage on turn 1, and then just bounce back like nothing happened. Because as long as they aren't just getting, you know, steamrolled by Mythos cards that are designed to kill Mark, it's so hard for Mark to actually get thrown off. He has enough healing and enough draw, and it's like, oh, I might have to stop tapping Sophie for a second. I'll put Tetsuo in play to stay safe, to not flip her, and then I'm going to, like, very shortly find some cards that let me draw, find some cards that let me heal, and eventually start tapping Sophie again. I've never seen Mark at my table just blow up, especially to his signature weakness. I don't even view it as a problem. I view it as health management. Like, if you're managing his health in the way that our table does, I just don't see Shell Shock ever deal more than 2, and I'm not afraid of Horror on Mark. If Horror is happening at all, he can heal himself for it with Soothing Melody at some point. Just give him the room to breathe. That's like all I have to say about Mark. The one weakness is that if he's completely stuck doing one thing for like 4 turns, like a nightmare fight scenario, he can start to feel a little frail. But he is so reliable, his numbers are so high, his draw is so ludicrous, and being able to translate all of that into team support with Bestow is kind of insane. As to where Mark falls specifically on the tier list, Harvey, Gloria, Amanda, and Daryl are all just completely busted in my eyes. Mark's almost there too. It's just that Mark doesn't start with Bestow Resolve, he doesn't start with Leveled Up Axe. He takes like a scenario to start being completely broken. At scenario 3, he's just as bad as these 4. But he's still remarkably reliable and very, very good in scenarios 1 and 2, make no mistake. As to the characters beneath them, I think Mark's ability to meaningfully improve his teammates' odds of passing Mythos test is notably more valuable than Tony getting some clues, for instance. Comparing Tony and Mark as main fighters, I view them both as very nearly immune to the Mythos deck. I view them both as being potentially frail, but in my experience, that's something you can easily pilot around and make decks where they don't really have to worry about it that much. Tony's slightly better at killing, Mark is vastly better at team support. I think they both have a little bit of experience before they start being truly broken, and comparing their scenarios 1 and 2, they're pretty remarkably similar, except that Tony's Mythos resilience is super reliant on like a specific combo for Infinite Soak, whereas Mark's whole deck sort of does the thing. Mark's built-in higher draw makes him more consistent than an early Tony. I think Mark is not tremendously better than Tony, but I do think he is better than Tony. Comparing either of them to Father Mateo and Jacqueline, who are so very different, I think Father Mateo tends to play greedier, and playing selfishly hurts him in a way that Mark doesn't. Mark just gets to do his own thing and support his team simultaneously in a way that I really don't feel like Father Mateo and Jacqueline do. I feel like when they're supporting their team, it's at pretty severe opportunity cost to themselves. They're still incredible. This is a very minor thing, but we're arguing like what degree of broken's the most broken between these characters, and it all starts to get blurry. I think Mark has the most freely available support to give to his team, and I think that's worth a lot. Additionally, if you don't have Ancient Covenant, Father Mateo can't really support you. If you are testing at base 1 to difficulty 3, Jacqueline's ability does not get you there. Mark is much better at supporting someone who desperately needs support than these 2 people right below him. They do have team support, but it's more about elevating somebody who's already going to succeed than getting somebody who was screwed over the finish line. I'm happy with this order. It's very close, very subjective, but I'm happy with that order. And to be clear, I have been ranking pretty much strictly Fighter Mark, just because he's easier to compare to others than Flex Mark. I think Flex Mark is basically the same power level, he just fits into different teams. But because he's such a unique type of Flex, basically only getting clues with 2 cards in the deck, it's very hard to compare him to other people. It's also funny to have the Flex that only uses 2 clue finding cards next to the other Flex that only uses 2 fighting cards. Anyways, that'll be all for now. I've been Rather Incoherent, thank you for your time. If you made it this far, then please do hit all the buttons to make the algorithm happy, I greatly appreciate it. And I cannot overstate my gratitude towards the people on Patreon supporting this channel, and the channel members here on YouTube doing the same. I'll see all of you in the next one.